Ben je aan het opnemen? Ja. Slim, sorry.
Oké. Dat is alleen maar niet uit. Niet bepaald.
Ik zou het niet opdrachten.
Mag je? Niks. Zie je tas staat er al.
That's you. Je zou zand in leggen. Dat weet ik nog niet. Soms best hoor, ik mag je zitten. Dat is wat anders.
Nee, maar je stijgt vast. Je staat helemaal op zijn plek.
Ja, jongen. Representing oh wow.
De eerste keer dat ik daar ooit geweest ben, toen was ik met die piano. Hij opdracht toen om overal binnen te weet je wat het is? Ja, dat is waar. Ja.
Wat S is.
Ja.
Ook in Nederlands. Want dat is niet interessant.
Nee, is niet interessant. Om te weten wat het precies is. Ik weet er niets van.
Would anyone like to say anything before whatever we do next? Any questions?
Elias, we had under the coffee break, I had a talk. And the talk is maybe not the subject for now, but we had a big talk about what is exactly a zigger. And we talked about many ziggers, the way they saw it in the Sufi movement in the past. But I don't know if we found some answers, but I'm curious, and maybe the person with whom I was talking to, about your answer somewhere.
Yeah, maybe you found the answer, which is no answer. I mean that by not being able to arrive at a conclusion, you're coming close. But is there closeness or farness? And I know we can talk this mystical talk, and then but in a way that's fair. It's like Mahara said last night, what is a better answer than love? She said it's, when we sing these zikrs, just let it be an expression of love. So then we could ask, well, what is love? Yeah. And then we could say, well, this whole show is love. I mean, it's an all expression of it.
Wow.
So, you know the answers of zikr being, it means to mention or to remember, to mention That is to mention the name of God. What's God's name? It isn't God. I mean, that's just, or is it Allah? Is that the name? Oh, there's 99 names. Oh, they say, oh, there's 1,000 names. Some of the early Sufis have count up 1,000 of them. Is that enough? Maybe.
Unnameable.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe God's names are all of these, slippers and socks and carpet and book and Mahara and Latifa and so on. Maybe this is all God's name. Innumerable, uncountable names. So we're going to mention all of them. So then we start calling it Allah or the One.
But then, what would I want to say? Yeah, then we went on. The song that we did this morning, for example, why is that not a zikr? So that was the question to me. And why do we another person call a zikr? I said, well, our melody is given in inspiration, but that's nonsense because it can be that this is also given in inspiration. As well, we were talking about grace and remembering and beautiful talk.
I think Elias says, and the old Sufis, he repeats from them, that actually you go out into the forest and you see the wind going through the leaves, and they're all whispering, they're all doing their zikr. Oh. And what about the atoms in the stones or in our bodies? What are these little, we have this image of this little atom with the middle and this electron that's, you can't, do you know they've never found an electron? I mean, they've never been able to see one. It's very small, I mean, very, very, very small. And in fact, it's not even really there. And then, if you go into the middle, the nucleus, right, which is very, very small, and it's, way deep inside where the electron is flipping around, or the electrons. And then, that's, got protons and neutrons, and what are they made out of? Well, they're made out of these quark thingless things. And the quarks have these weird, qualities of charm and whatever it's called, anyway, they're not there. When you read into the physics of it, pretty soon the physicists sound like us. I mean, the quarks are there, but then they're not really there. And then they're there, but what are they? So this is a kind of, whoa. And that's what we're made out of. Are we here? It's identical to our being this intersection between emptiness and appearance. Something and nothing. That comes all the way up, doesn't it? As above, so below. Or as in, so out. The whole thing is here, not here. In a sense, we're dreamlike. This is all dreamlike, because the present moment takes up no time. Anyway, we'll come back to that. But so it's all zikkering. It's mentioning. What is it mentioning? Here, not here.
Sometimes it's easy because you're sure you have you're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
If I'm talking about a chair, well, you can sit on it.
Yeah.
It's like you're talking about a cigar, you mean something else than I do. There'll be confusion.
Yeah, but there are many ways. I mean, in Morocco, where I studied, they don't think this, they wouldn't call this zikr. I mean, that's not their style or tradition. They have the zikr is sitting there with your beads, and going like, That's doing zikr. And you do that for hours and hours and hours. And, or you go, and aloud and quiet. And the Naqshbandis never speak their zikr. It's always silent. Nice, huh? The zikr is silent. And they say they never stop. I was talking to one Qadiri zikr, Qadiri Sufi in Morocco. And we were standing on a street corner, and he was saying this. He says, we Sufis never stop saying zikr. I said, are you doing it right now? I can still remember him on the street corner. Absolutely.
When they sleep?
I guess. The whole thing is doing it. I don't know if he's doing it, but after a while, you do this long enough, that kind of zikr, repetitive, it does it by itself. And actually what it does, now I'm getting off topic, but it's still zikr topic. What it does is you've done it so much and so continually that the self-talk really has, when you're not doing zikr, when you're not, repeating it, it's pushed away all of the need for self-talk. I believe, and most of you have heard me say this, because it's been my experience, that if you do that kind of repetitive thing, maybe it's the same with mantras, like Om, or Gate, Parasam. You do that long enough, it's running through the brain and all the neurons, and those have gotten, the image that I have is that over our lifetime, with our little storytelling and so on, they've gotten a little bit tangled, or sometimes very tangled, especially if we've been abused or had really serious traumas or something. They get locked into that thing. That's why the traumas keep coming back, or the tendency for anxiety or paranoia or whatever, or self-judgment. That's a neural tendency. It gets locked into the physical setup of the brain. And it just repeats itself. I'm a little worried. Everybody's going to be looking at me. I don't know what to think. What can I say next? That kind of, that's a repetitive tangle. What zikr can do is you keep going. Imagine if you got all that little tangle up in your neurons, and then the brain starts going like, pretty soon those neurons aren't doing that little tangle anymore. It's the image I use is it's like brushing your hair inside. It's like brushing all the neurons free, And then because when you were a little baby, your neurons were nice and clear, they were well combed. Or they didn't even have to be combed, they were free. So the zikr tends to do that, if you do it enough. So we could say, tonight we'll comb we'll brush our hair.
Right, at the same time, when I do zikr, sometimes, and it doesn't matter what kind of zikr, this voice can go on.
Yeah.
Because the repeating of my zikr, it becomes so familiar that this voice can overrule it.
Yeah. But the thing, yes, and that little voice that's there has a little less purchase, a little less, it doesn't have quite the grab on the whole being. And just keep doing it, keep doing it. After a while, it's not so, what it's trying to announce is a little, it's trivial. It's a little trivial. And it gradually lessens. Not that it totally goes away, but just it's not so interesting.
I remember long ago, Moshe Kazel taught this zikr and universal with using, there was no melody, it was just la ilaha illallah, and using your head in a certain way, so it was at that time very much the sentence and a movement with your head, and that was very strongly at that point introduced as zikr.
Yeah.
And that's also a form.
Absolutely. In fact, I remember him saying, and I kind of believe it still, is that all zikr has movement in it. I mean, back then we were talking about this kind of thing. But the good thing about movement, like when we're doing zikr in the evenings and singing, it's beautiful to sway. You'll notice your body wants to sway, or your hands might want to lift up. It's okay. Or many Sufis, will do dancing or bowing, or, there's a kind of...
But there's also an inner movement.
yes,
You feel
Yeah.
moved,
yeah,
if you don't need to.
that's right. It's movement forever, yeah. In fact, isn't melody I don't know where the movement is, but it's the movement of sound, isn't it? Yeah.
Coming back to the meaning, well, I pose that the zikr is meant to be the right setting to give you the possibility for the remembrance.
Yeah,
For the what?
yeah.
Doing the
Yeah,
remembrance.
yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
state of being, or
Mhm.
an honorability, or how you call it.
Yeah, the problem with zikr often, and mantrayana, as the Buddhists would call it, the way of mantras, repetitive thing, is that we can get a little addicted to that particular style. So if we started doing gatte, parasam, gatte, bodhisvaha, well, that's somebody else's story. I do but I think I've told you before, the shaykh I worked with in Fez, he said, I asked him, well, is there something magic with this? He was a little radical. And he says, with the words, la ilaha. He says, no. You could say potato, potato, potato. If it had the resonance of your meaning in it. But that's pretty radical, because we like these things. Allah, there's something beautiful about these pure sounds. Allah is a beautiful one because it's rooted in ah. And that's the open glottis. That's this ah. It's just open. That's the sound we make when we're not interrupting anything. Ah. But it's okay. There are many, many sounds. But I like what you said, Akka, that we don't... At a certain point, when we say remembrance, well, do you need to do zikr if you remember? I mean, once you remember, do you have to keep saying the zikr? I mean, why would you have to say, hey, don't forget, I don't forget. So then zikr becomes like a song, because we like doing it, because it's fun, or because it makes us feel happy. But all these practices are just ways to come near, and then we put ourselves in the way of grace, and then we don't. And then when it's like what Ibn Arabi says, you have the zikr of the tongue, that's the out loud, then the zikr of the imagination, which is silent. Same thing, you just bring it in. And then the zikr of the heart, where it sort of pulses there, even prior to the formation of the sound. And then there's the zikr of the secret, which is, nobody speaks of it. My sense is that it's the zikr of the secret is you don't need the zikr anymore. It's pure remembrance. It's presence without. Here it is. And then we drift, and so we have la ilaha. whatever form of remembrance we need. So I would go back to Elvira and say, yeah, this zikkering is, it's just a way to remind ourselves. And we don't even want to make it into a holy thing, that you have to do it in order to be a good Sufi. You don't have to do the la ilaha, you just remind yourself, be reminded. And if the song of the rustling of the leaves can do it for you, that's zikr. That's enough. But we need some time here because this is, I hope you've all been quite heavily caffeinated because I want to jump into this next. Hopefully we can get a lot of it, through a lot of it, this, at least set the stage during this session. Because I'd like to introduce the outlines of the philosophy of Henri. Henri Bergson, because it's a way of approaching our subject of joyous cosmology, which is quite a little different from how we're used to. And yet it's a delight, I found it a delight, his work and his thought. Because he's not fundamentally out of a religious tradition. And yet, he comes out of a philosophic tradition. And yet he's absolutely resonant with the mystic recognition. Curiously, his life, he was born in 1859, but he lived until 1942. And so his life spanned and encompassed Inayat Khan's, and they lived close together. I mean, he was French, he lived in Paris. And I've searched through Inayat Khan's work to see if there's any mention of Bergson. I haven't found any. But the whole thing is redolent with, that's a nice word, redolent. They seem to be expressing in their own ways a kind of, what was it? I think of it as a meme, that was coming through the time that was expressed this way and that. But I can't believe that Inayat Khan didn't know about Bergson, because all of the intellectual types of his circle, Inayat Khan's circle, must have gone to Bergson's lectures. Henri Bergson was the most celebrated philosopher in the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th. Also in America. He traveled to America often. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1927, but he was apparently, as a speaker and a character and so on, it was humble and yet very delightful to listen to. His lectures in Paris or in London or in New York were flooded. People would be out in the streets waiting. They were so inspiring to be in his presence and to listen to him talk. I would have loved it. And extremely influential. He was highly honored. There was a whole list of awards and honors and honorable degrees he got.
Can you repeat the name?
Henri Bergson. B-E-R-G-S-O-N. Bergson. And but he's mostly now forgotten. Or at least there's a bit of a revival actually now in Bergsonian philosophy. But he was extremely influential. What is that? Oh, I wish I wrote down that page. Oh yeah. impacted in their work include these literary figures such as Marcel Proust, Nikos Kazantzakis, Virginia Woolf, Thomas Wolfe, Wallace Stevens, James Joyce, William Faulkner, T.S. Eliot, Willa Cather, George Bernard Shaw, D.H. Lawrence. And then on the philosophers, deeply influenced William James. He was good friends with William James. Alfred North Whitehead, they were also friends. Anyway, any others here? Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Gilles Deleuze, Levinas, and so on. And so he had this big effect, and in a way all of our Western culture was actually influenced by this man's work and by his recognitions, even though he sort of disappeared a bit from view. You know. One of the reasons why he disappeared, well, it's lots of things. Existentialism came on, and this kind of, it was a little bit dark. But partly because in 1922, and this is just when Inaya Khan was holding forth in Surat, isn't it? There was a very famous, supposedly, debate between Bergson and Einstein. Einstein was younger, 20 years younger, I think. But here's in 1922, there's the most famous physicist in the world. Great mind is Albert Einstein, right? And the most famous philosopher in the world, Henri Bergson. And I mean, Bergson was sometimes mentioned as one of the 4 great philosophers of all time. You know, Aristotle, or whatever, Plato, Kant, and Bergson. And so they came together, and it wasn't really a debate, but it was in Paris, and it was in 1922, and it was really supposed to be a conversation about time, because time, of course, was Einstein's big exploration about the nature of time. And so it was with Bergson. And in fact, his first work, Bergson's first work was called Time and Free Will. In fact, the titles of his work are helpful. That was the first major work, and then Matter and Memory, the next one. And then a smaller book called Laughter, which is still studied by comedians today. They read Bergson's work on laughter. And his great masterpiece was Creative Evolution. And then one of his final works, which is sort of quintessential, it's a shorter one, called The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. More about that later. In any case, Einstein, Bergson, they had this thing. Bergson gave a talk, and he was very gracious and so on. Einstein, apparently, what I've read of it, was very short and kind of rude. And he said this line, which people interpreted later that it was dismissive of him. He said, "The time of the philosophers is over." He said that to Bergson. The time, that means it's a double entendre, right? Basically, what Bergson was pointing out is that we have, in the way we're structured and think, we have conflated time with space, which is what conflated. We've mixed it up with time with space, so that, and it's quite logical that we do this, so that there's this moment. Notice what I'm doing. There's this moment, and then there's this moment. We think of time as being located in space. We have a little watch or a clock, and the second hands are, the second is marking the seconds, right? It's there, and now it's there, and now it's there, and now it's there. And all these little lines on the clock are ways we assume that time is connected to space, right? And in the same way that physicists, remember you all studied in school physics, you roll that little, Galileo, and so you roll down a little ball down a little incline, and it's here, now it's here, and these are measured in time, it's in this space and this space, so that we've come to think of it as linked to space. Bergson had a totally different view of it. He acknowledges that within that dimension, that's quite logical. But he offered something else, and what he called it was one of his major themes was what he called durée. Durée in French means something like duration, okay? But that's a poor translation, I'm told. Martin, wherever you are. I don't know if you have a sense of durée other than if it's an exact translation across to duration, but most of the translators into English they avoid calling it duration, they just call it durée, because it has some other quality to it.
I don't know
You don't know,
really
okay.
the qualities of
Yeah.
duration.
I'm thinking of a way in which you can describe waves. If you think at waves like water, it's a wave going that way.
Yeah.
But there's also another wave which is going that way, and that's how sound goes. So I'm not talking, this is just...
That's a little...
for me, this is durée, and for me, this is the other dimension of waves.
You can...
Would it make sense?
Close. I think that's getting, that's pointing to it. He calls it, he relates it to consciousness. Basically, he says, consciousness or awareness, let's use consciousness interchangeably right here. In a way, he called it the dynamic flow of consciousness. That's durée. It's what we actually experience right now. It is the dynamic flow of our consciousness. And that is time as well. And you notice that your own awareness, does it flow? These are all approximate words, but notice how we are this dynamic flow of consciousness. It never stays the same, it's always new, and yet it's continual, so it's always continual. Let's say, I'm going to have to read you a few, is much better than mine, struggling to find how to express it. Some descriptions. This, by the way, this book that I'm going to rely upon is called Living Consciousness, another way to call durée. It's a living consciousness. It's a good work in English about Bergson's work. I've been plodding through now 2.5 books of Bergson, but it's a little more difficult to follow his way of speaking.
French, it's different
Yeah.
words.
And his father was English, so he was fluent. Was it mother?
I think it's mother.
Mother or father? I wanted to mention that he was, after this, before I jump into durée, just to finish a little bit in his life, was highly honored. But after this thing with Einstein, and then people considered that he lost the debate. It wasn't really much give and take there, but it didn't matter. He was very humble and true soul and so on, and he his mother, one of his parents was Jewish. And so he, once the Germans at the end of the 30s invaded France in the Vichy government, he's still living in Paris. There was a moment there, he's 80, 81, something like that. And the Germans said, okay, at one point they said all Jews have to register as Jews there. And so actually by that time, Bergson he never practiced Judaism. It was he had a very kind of liberal, progressive family. They weren't strongly religious in any way. He was gravitating towards a kind of mystic Catholicism towards the end of his life. In any case, because he had a Jewish mother, and that's supposed to be Jewish, you can't get out of it, right? But the government knew that, and they knew that he was this great philosopher. So they said, "Oh no, we'll make an exception to you. You are an honorary Aryan, and you don't have to register." And he said, "No." He says, "Now's not the time to abandon. I'm going to say, okay, no, these are my people too." So he went to register, and it was in the middle of winter, and he had to stand in line for 2 days, and it was raining. And the old man, he suffered the last decade or more of his life. He suffered a great deal from rheumatoid arthritis, but he was still sharp as a tack. Anyway, he stood in line to be registered, and he caught pneumonia and died. But his kind of standing with wisdom, I can't help it. There's nice little anecdotes from his life. There was where did they put that? Yeah, listen to this. This is an interview where he was talking about feminism, and this is 1921 or something. And he considered, quote, the present feminist movement, at that time, it was all about suffrage and the right to vote and equal rights. He said, the present feminist movement, I consider the greatest event in the history of civilization since the promulgation of the Christian ideal. Wow. And he asserted, quote, not until women have every right that men have can we hope for a further development of the human race. That's strong, isn't it? And that was right out of time. I mean, that he was right at crossways to the resistance of the development of feminism. And he also is credited with, he actually, well, that's what this book is about. That one of the men who was instrumental in the development of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the Charter of the UN, and then most importantly, the Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, I think it came out, but it was post-war. You've heard me talk about this probably before, that these declarations, and that was one of the great first ones, are a powerful point in the evolution of our species, I believe. And there are a whole series of them since the UN Declaration of Human Rights. There have been many. The Declaration of the Rights of Women, of Indigenous Peoples, of Children, of the Earth Charter, the World Parliament of Religions has a beautiful declaration of the unity. They call it something else, but it's the unity of religious ideals. It's fascinating that Inayat Khan was a beautiful expression of this unity. It was at the heart of his work. Universal Sufism was born through Inayat, right? And at the same time was this being expressed in a different way through Bergson. In fact, I can't resist saying this, Bergson has this, he recognized that, he said that there's the growth in our, let's say, ethical sense, and this is at the heart of his last work, the one that said, the title, Two Sources of Morality and Religion. And in there he speaks of how, in our own sense, we're first loyal to ourselves and our ethical natures that we want, what's good for ourselves, and then we want it for our family, right? Our identity is first with ourselves, and then our family, our close blood ties, and that's who we protect, care for, and our ethical nature is connected to our family. After that, it extends to perhaps our extended family, and then to our clan, and then to the tribe. Okay, so we're a part of this tribe now, and we have to be careful of that tribe over there, but our tribe, we're all pretty good, right? Maybe this is more like a clan size, but our tribe would be a little bigger. Or maybe it would be, our identity would include our village. That's where usually the tribe would live in the village, encampment or something. And we'd be very wary of those ones who are different. And then gradually they developed more of a sense of, okay, maybe a regional identity. Those of us who live in this valley, or out on this island, or wherever, on these mountains. Then perhaps it's our identity with our ethnic, the color of our skin, or our language group. See, it gets bigger and bigger. So this, and goes further and further until now we identify with our nation. Okay, the Dutch, the Amidons. We've come up to this. It's an evolution that sure there are all of these smaller groups within it, but we are American, or we are. So, the French are very French, the Germans are very German, and that's all been, that whole progression has what Bergson calls, there's a difference in scale. But now, the shift, is there anything left after nations? It's this universal identity. But that, Bergson says, is not a difference in scale, it's a difference in kind. Because if we were to have a universal identity, just like with the unity of religious ideals, it's the same ideal, recognition. There's no one outside it. We can't define our universal identity as well, what about the people on Mars or something? Maybe try.
Finding out.
Yeah. But in order to make that shift, Bergson says, it's a difference in kind. It's a total different shift of identity as one. And he said that's the great challenge of our species at this time. And we're still in the midst of that, right? And we haven't succeeded. But that recognition is one easy way to speak of it, is at the root of this, it became at the heart of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? And that's a major shift to that recognition. And do all the nations of the world respect it? No. They've signed it, but they don't respect it yet. They don't really get it. In a sense, our job is to make it real. That's our challenge. And in a way, that's, I think, why many of us have been attracted to this universal Sufism of Inayat Khan.